Pleasure to welcome you to the Stimson Center for today's event, Assessing Opportunities for the Protection of Civilians in Sudan. My name is Rachel Stoll. I'm Senior Vice President here at the Stimson Center, and really pleased to welcome you here to talk about a conflict that has often been overshadowed by current and political events, but that now constitutes the world's largest hunger and displacement crisis. Over the past 18 months, the civil war in Sudan has had a horrendous impact on civilians. The conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and rapid support forces has led to well over 20,000 deaths, with the actual number likely much higher, and forcibly displaced more than 11 million inside and outside the country. More than half of the population is facing acute food insecurity, with famine officially declared in North Darfur. This conflict has really seen heinous acts and atrocities, including the targeting of civilians based on gender and ethnicity, recruitment and use of children by forces, extensive sexual violence, and widespread destruction of essential civilian infrastructure. Just last month, the Human Rights Council's fact-finding mission for Sudan confirmed assessments that the warring parties and allied militias have committed war crimes, with the Rapid Support Forces and its allied militias also responsible for crimes against humanity. Over the past year and a half, multilateral engagement on Sudan has largely been aimed at halting the conflict through a cessation of hostilities or ceasefire. The United States has remained at the forefront of these efforts, first through the Jeddah process and most recently as the lead convener of the Aligned for Advancing Life-Saving and Peace in Sudan group talks. As an organization, the Stimson Center dives deep into complex challenges and situations that require independent research and analysis, global engagement, and policy innovation. The conflict in Sudan is no exception. Through our work, we know it is imperative that we listen to the voices on the ground of those affected and hear experts on what is taking place and what more can be done to address it. We are grateful to partners such as the SNR Evermay Foundation and Global Affairs Canada, who have been supporting some of the work that the Protecting Civilians and Human Security program has been doing and have been engaged on in Sudan. Stimson also recognizes how critical strong partnerships are to advancing the promotion and respect for human rights around the world. We are thus delighted that today's event has been organized in collaboration with the Partnership for Effective Peacekeeping. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a Washington, D.C.-based nonpartisan working group led by the Better World Campaign, the Center for Civilians in Conflict, Refugees International, and Stimson. For over 20 years, this partnership has brought together research, policy, advocacy, and humanitarian communities to identify the challenges that are facing UN peace operations, promote ways to strengthen international peacekeeping capacity, and maintain U.S. support for peace operations. Now, that's all you're going to hear from me today, because you're really here to hear from our experts. It is my pleasure to introduce Tom Perriello, U.S. Special Envoy for Sudan. Tom previously served as the Special Envoy for the Great Lakes and Democratic Republic of Congo. Among his many credentials, he also worked on the ground in Darfur while with the International Center for Transitional Justice. And if his executive branch service isn't enough to qualify him, Perriello was also elected to Congress when he represented the Virginia's 5th Congressional District, where he served as a founding member of the Leaders National Security Working Group and the House Veterans Affairs Committee. He also led the Center for American Progress Action and the Open Societies Foundations for the United States. Stimson is particularly grateful for the support from OSF under his tenure, and his support for nonprofits focused on bolstering democracy, advancing human rights and racial justice, and addressing climate change. On a personal note, and to measure his commitment, I was very pleased to have had the opportunity to connect with Tom during a flight back from Geneva this August, as he and his team were returning from the most recent talks with Sudan actors. And I really saw firsthand how engaged, even on a very long flight, after a very long week, that he and his team were to identifying next steps. Tom, thank you for joining us today and for your ongoing leadership in pushing for a much-needed peace in Sudan. I'm now going to turn over to Lisa Sharland, Senior Fellow and Director of the Protecting Civilians and Human Security Program at Stimson. Lisa and Tom will engage in a conversation about the U.S.'s ongoing efforts to achieve a ceasefire in Sudan, and after that, we will turn to a panel discussion moderated by Hardin Lang, Vice President of Policy and Programs at Refugees International. Lisa, over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Rachel, and thank you to everyone who has come along today to join us in person and to those who are joining us online and virtually for today's discussion. Mr. Perriello, thank you so much for joining us at Stimson to take part in today's discussion. As we've heard there from Rachel, I don't need to go into depth, I think, about some of the challenges and the catastrophe that we're facing in Sudan at the moment. The civil war has been raging for 18 months. The impact on civilians has been devastating. Alarm bells have been going off in terms of atrocities, crimes against humanity and risks to civilians. We have a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding, yet it has been a real struggle to garner global attention on this crisis. And I think in particular compounding this is we see a really sophisticated conflict taking place with a range of different actors, despite the fact that we have UN Security Council sanctions and an arms embargo. So these are many of the issues that you are grappling with in your very extensive portfolio as US Special Envoy for Sudan. And I think it's fair to say that most of us don't envy some of the challenges that you're trying to address in that portfolio at the moment. But I wanted to get to a couple of these issues as we start our conversation today. To begin with, I thought it might be helpful to hear from you directly about the ongoing efforts to broker a ceasefire. We had the talks that took place in Geneva that faced several challenges. We have the work through the ALPS group in terms of consultations taking place. And so I thought maybe to start, can you provide an update on where these discussions are currently up to and perhaps provide some context on how efforts to protect civilians are featuring in these discussions?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for any effort to draw attention to this crisis, and thank you to Stimson for all of the great work that you all do. And to everyone in the room who's part of the small but mighty band of folks that are trying to end this conflict and end this famine. I've been trying to focus on the positive, which is difficult in this role, and I will say that there is something of a blessing not only in knowing every day that you wake up and you're not, as I said to someone earlier, I know where every member of my family is and I know where my next meal is coming from, but also there's something positive about being in a position to try to do something about it, even if we fail more often than we succeed. And I think everyone in this room, regardless of your background, has some power to affect this. And I think the only thing worse in life than seeing this level of injustice and not being able to do anything about it, and being able to do something about it, is to look at it and not. That being said, we are in a situation where the scale of human suffering is just impossible to wrap one's head around, whether that's at the scale of over 20 million people displaced and facing acute hunger. I mean, we're talking about just trying to imagine if every single resident of Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. was forced out of their home, every single person. It's difficult to think on that scale. And then you think on the personal scale and you hear stories of people who've been forced into sexual slavery for months on end as the only way to either have food for their family. Like when we think about hunger, we have to think about what hunger does to people. Physically, biologically, but also what it does to people in terms of the decisions they're making every day, the way that children's brains are developing. I mean, we're talking about just, you take one individual case and you can't wrap your head around it. And so it's all the more frustrating when we know that the world is paying so little attention to this relative to the scale of the crisis. And while we can talk about the fact that there's the elections, Gaza and the Ukraine, for the first 6 or 7 months of this conflict, it was pre-October 7th. It was not in the immediate election cycle, and we still were seeing almost no coverage of this. And while it is certainly true that we've seen that in the Western world, it's also been true that we've had a hard time getting the African press to cover this. We've had a hard time getting African civil society to engage on this for reasons we can perhaps delve into more. That being said, of course, there's one group of people that are incredibly focused on this with great courage, and that's the Sudanese people. And the Sudanese people continue to not only remind us that why we were all inspired back in 2019 about the aspiration to inclusive democracy, but we see groups like the emergency response rooms getting nominated for a Nobel Prize, finding ways to get food and medicine into the hardest to reach areas. doing so with pennies on the dollar in terms of aid. And we are seeing some of that scale up. And I think that our hope, the phrase I've been hearing more and more from the Sudanese people in the last few weeks, is let's make this the last war Sudan ever fights. So rather than a period where we've been looking at what's the lowest common denominator, let's just get to ceasefire, let's just get a pause, and we will continue to push for those things. But we're not even getting those things. And I think that's been driving people back to saying we can't be here a generation from now or a decade from now. We need to address some of the root causes that got us through this. And I'm seeing this kind of resurgence of some of that energy and that coalition building, envisioning by the Sudanese people of the future that they want and calling us into it rather than vice versa. So we will get into more details, I think, about things like the breakthroughs in the Alps. And I think while the visible breakthrough was the humanitarian access, we did get 3 major arteries open. We've gotten tens of millions of pounds in, but it's obviously small compared to what's needed. I think the bigger issue in some ways was trying to break up the diplomatic paralysis that had kicked in, that people were just like, Sudan, what are you going to do? And we were like, here's something you can do. And we have no excuses to not put wins on the board. And internally, I think you would seen within various places, including inside the SAF government coalition, the more hardline elements and extremist elements gaining more power, those who wanted to find a peace, wanted to get to civilian transition, losing power, and in ways that probably weren't as public. That effort and the way it played out really was meant to shake that up, and I think it has. So I think we have some opportunities on the board now that weren't there before. But obviously, in the meantime, we've seen not only a failure of ceasefires, but actually a significant escalation and spread of the conflict. And that's the reality people are facing today.
You've outlined a very challenging picture there in terms of, but also I think looking a little bit at some of the areas where there's been some progress. And I want to go a little bit to the humanitarian access point. We know in parts of the country, particularly around El Fasher, developments we've seen in the Zamzam camp, for instance. I think in recent days, MSF has put something out about some of the challenges in terms of their ability to deliver aid at the moment in Darfur. And I guess on that point, could you elaborate a little bit about what are the priorities around humanitarian access at the moment and trying to facilitate the ability of organisations to get in and address the famine and the food insecurity that we're seeing and basic needs that aren't being met?
Yeah, I mean, at the biggest level, obviously the priority is to get food, medicine to all 18 states, and particularly to those people and groups of people that are in the most acute need. I think the subtext is to eliminate the use of starvation as a weapon of war, sexual exploitation as a weapon of war. And unfortunately, while we have made some significant tactical gains with both HAC and SARA, with both the SAF and RSF sides on access routes, there has not yet been a fundamental switch in the thinking that says you just, even when the war is going on, there's certain stuff you just don't do. You don't block food and aid going in. And even if you have to for a day or two, right? People have been doing for centuries across every continent the idea of finding a way to make sure innocent people can get food and medicine during these periods. So trying to depoliticize and de-weaponize food and medicine is really the key. Now, where does that play out? Obviously, the 3 combinations of Adre access from the west, the Daba road coming in from the east, the Sennar route, which is mostly open with a circumvention, gets the humanitarian community some access to a lot of places. Now, we continue to have days, obviously, where rain gets in the way, but far too many of the days are where we continue to see delays, particularly from HAC and SAF. We have areas of the South Kordofans, including South Kordofan, whether that's Kadugli or some of the other areas, that are probably not going to have access from the south for some time. There are many people in the room that know this detail better than us. That means getting some of the air routes open. The air routes aren't just about airlifts, but it's about the ability to have international hubs on the ground with evacuation routes, which opens up a whole different set of possibilities. As the rains recede, we need to be 5x, 10x this. There's a whole other bucket of stuff, though, and I do think that USAID has been creative about this, but again, we need to supercharge it, which is what we might call localization efforts, but it's really the bucket of everything from cash and vouchers to ERRs and mutual aid to business and bakeries and other things. And we know this is good policy even in a different environment, but in an environment like this, we really need to be thinking creatively about how to unleash the innovation of the Sudanese people, the courage and risk-taking of the Sudanese people. And again, I think by humanitarian standards, it's been super edgy, but by the standards of what's needed in the conflict, we are still way too conservative on this. And I think what we need to be seeing in the coming months is a greater emphasis on that as well.
If we could pivot for just a moment, you mentioned there at the outset the role of civil society and how fundamental this has been to, I think, engaging in efforts to address the conflict, everything from the emergency response rooms to the innovation that we've seen taking place. Next week in New York, we're going to have the UN Security Council meeting again on the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And we know women are pivotal to these efforts that are taking place and also have a fundamental role in contributing to peace processes that take place, that at the end of the day, that will contribute to more sustainable peace and outcomes from the evidence that we've seen. So one of the criticisms, I think, of some of the talks that has taken place is that women perhaps have been sidelined a little bit from the process or perhaps not actively engaged in the negotiations. And so I wanted to ask you, how are women being engaged in the processes that are taking place to foster a peace and look at a ceasefire?
So first, on the underlying premise, I think it's unquestionable. Not only are you more likely to get a peace deal, it's more likely to be sustained, it's more likely to be just and equitable when women are not only at the table but playing a central role. I think that we have been making progress from a very low bar on that in terms of ALPS, where obviously there was a group of women technical experts initially across town, then in the town, then in the room, and then helping to shape and edit the command directive that the RSF eventually did sign on to, though there's a lot of work obviously to do to change that. I think part of what the shift we're looking at right now, though, is if you go back to before my time, the theory, which I think was a good theory, was that you would have ceasefire here and political discussion here. And the ceasefire was meant to be for like external actors and armed actors to end the war, but not decide the political future of Sudan, which was meant to be here. And in this space, not only was it meant to be civilian-led and centered by the Sudanese, but with heavy participation by women and youth. That's a good theory, right? But in practice, the ceasefire piece had a name, it had the U.S. involved in it, it had dates, Jeddah, Manama, et cetera, and the political process has not taken the same kind of form. And so the end result of it has been, even if the theory was to actually always have women at the center, in practice, the focus has been to put too much of the attention and focus on the armed actors and really give either one a veto over the process. So I think it's not just, the tendency has been to say, how do we bring women more into this table? And that's certainly important. But I think what we're looking at now is how do we reimagine the table? If this split wasn't working, even if I think it was good in theory, how do we actually recenter the political questions in the civilian process as being the thing driving this rather than where we've been in those dynamics? It won't be easy to do, but certainly it has a better chance of succeeding and a better chance of producing a good outcome. And we need to make it not something where women are invited into that table, but women are, shaping that table and driving it.
No, absolutely. And I think that's something that I'm sure we're going to get into in the panel discussion that's going to follow. I wanted to turn briefly to some of the external actors that are engaged in the conflict that's taking place at the moment. US President Biden recently met with the president of the UAE. And there was some criticism, I think, around the fact that there was no condemnation of some of the activities that were happening to support the RSF in terms of the conflict at the moment in Sudan. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about how is the US government approaching efforts to stem the flow of arms into Sudan at the moment, which is obviously driving a lot of the conflict and atrocities against civilians, but also what tools are you using to apply pressure to some of these external actors and proxies at the moment?
Well, the U.S., under Linda Thomas-Greenfield's leadership, really led the fight to extend the Darfur arms embargo that's been on for some time. but more importantly, not just to extend it, but to try to enforce it. So we've put 2 names forward of people violating that arms embargo. So far, the Russians have had that on hold. We want to see that kind of enforcement expanded. We've signaled in every multilateral forum, as well as to all the actors, that now is not the time to be sending in guns and fueling the conflict, but rather to be partners in humanitarian efforts and peace efforts. You have seen increasing discussion in various forums, including at the GCC, of a potential national arms embargo in this situation. So I think that there's no question about that. We recently sanctioned Algoni Dagalo, who has been running procurements for the RSF. We have previously sanctioned some of the businesses involved in fueling this conflict, including through that procurement. We're working with a larger number of external partners on doing so. So I think that question of raising the costs, both of internal and external actors supporting the war, is very important. Looking at greater, not just multilateral kind of statements on paper, but enforcement of those will be important for this. And it is a classic case where if we can get people from maximalist interest to mutual interest, everybody benefits from, pretty much everybody benefits from this being stabilized and getting back on that inclusive civilian track, and almost everybody loses from a continuation of the status quo. So it's a very important part of getting to resolution.
No, I appreciate that. One final question from me before we might turn to the audience for 1 or 2 questions. In terms of protection of civilians, we've had the UN Human Rights Council fact-finding mission. It came out with a report in September this year with a call for an independent and impartial force with a mandate to protect civilians in Sudan, although this was, of course, rejected by the Sudanese authorities. And we've also had a request from the Security Council for the UN Secretary-General to come back with recommendations on protection of civilians in Sudan, and that is expected to be shared at the end of October. So with that in mind, what international mechanisms do you think should be under consideration when it comes to protection of civilians? Notwithstanding, I think, the fact that there are very urgent protection needs and these mechanisms can take a while to stand up. And at the same time, taking into account some of the local mechanisms that we already know are in place, and how do we ensure that we are investing in those resources as well and not just deferring to some kind of international intervention?
Well, one of the things I love about coming to Stimson is that it always comes with a homework assignment. So I got mine today on the civilian protection lessons from Sudan, which I think is important. There are many things that are depressing contrasts about when I was engaged on Darfur 20 plus years ago versus now. And certainly one of the most stark contrasts is the geopolitical appetite for civilian protection mechanisms, responsibility to protect, et cetera, back in that time versus now. Certainly, Secretary Blinken, President Biden, and others have spoken about this need in Sudan. We spent a lot of time in the Swiss talks building, or the talks in Switzerland, I don't want to impose it all on the Swiss, talking about both a monitoring mechanism for existing agreements like the Jeddah Declaration and IHL, but also potentially enforcing an additional agreement. Got agreement that the African Union, this was a good chance to lead, got some buy-in across different actors. And then, frankly, in the build-up to the General Assembly, the UNGA, when we thought we would get more support for that, some of the air came out of it. And so we will continue to push for that. We do think the African Union would be well situated to pursue this, whether it's an accountability mechanism, a monitoring mechanism, or something more. And at the moment, we just have to be realistic that there's not a lot of regional or geopolitical support or financial support for that. So we can continue to advocate for it, which we can. But we shouldn't be putting all the eggs in that basket. Now, I think that it's a good moment to think back on what some of the tools at that time were, some of the hybrid mechanisms, more light touch and agile mechanisms that we can get there. Now, sanctions can do a little bit of accountability, but it's got to be part of a broader strategy. We need more people to come along with it. As you noted, the best systems are always built from within. And I think that we do want to try to build off of more indigenous mechanisms of both accountability and monitoring, but also recognize, of course, that the risks are extremely high. The telecom is still down in significant parts of the country. And so it's a place where we are simply failing the people. But documentation of abuses is important, continuing to deter where we can, and continuing to fight for something more comprehensive as soon as we can. It's certainly something that the Women's Stakeholder Group, which I spoke to this morning, and overlapped heavily with the group in Switzerland, has pushed for. When we got the command directive from the RSF, it was good in that we've not had that before, and Hemeti himself, personally signed off on it and took responsibility. But it's a tool; it's not an end, right? So the question is, now that that tool is there, that creates a greater accountability mechanism. How do we turn that into results? How do we change the behavior? And on that, again, we have a long way to go.
So I think we might have 5 minutes, if that's possible, in terms of tracking with your time, Mr. Perriello.
Sure.
But we might go to the audience. I see a few hands. So I'll take a couple of questions here. We also do have the ability to take questions online. I just ask people to introduce themselves by name and organisation when asking your question. So I think we might start here.
Thank you. My name is
And wait for the microphone, sorry.
Yeah, of course. Is it turned on? Okay, my name is Amr Hassan. I work with Al Jazeera Mubashir. And my question is about the accusation from the RSF side to the Egyptian army that is supporting the SAF. Is this, can the US verify this in any way, shape, or form? And what is the US position from that if proven true? That's A. And B, help us understand how UAE is allegedly supporting the RSF in Sudan, while Egypt is supporting the Sudanese army in that case, while at the same time, right before these accusations, Mohammed bin Zayed was in Egypt to extend economic bilateral relationships. Is there any leverage for the US to sit with these countries to at least stop funding these fighting parties in that situation? And I have more questions, but I guess that's it. Thank you.
Okay, we might take 2 more if that's okay. We'll group them together. Yes.
European embassies to talk to you on this subject as well. My question would be if you could say something about spillover effects, especially concerning the humanitarian aspects into other countries in the region. Thank you.
Okay, and I think the last question here from this gentleman.
Hi, I'm Simon Billiness with No Business with Genocide. We do a lot of work lobbying Congress on a range of issues, including Sudan. And I'd like to ask, there are a lot of bills in Congress right now focusing on Sudan, looking at the role of the UAE, suggesting other sanctions, looking at a genocide determination around the RSF. Where do you think the attention of Congress is best focused at this time in order to get the best results in Sudan?
So let me take those in reverse order. As someone who served in both the executive and the legislative, I will definitely have learned the lesson of not telling the legislative branch what to do. What I will say, without getting into the specifics of which bills are best, is to note that the bipartisan consensus about Sudan on the Hill has been consistent for many years across administrations and is a very crucial part of the U.S. engagement with Sudan. It is one reason why, while I can't speak to future administrations, I think that there's probably less reason to believe you'll see, that Sudan policy will be interrupted than in other areas that you might. That's been true of both the House and the Senate, both Republicans and Democrats. You have an odd mix of constituencies there and leaders on it. I think the general tenor of Congress is probably for greater accountability, greater use of negative incentives to both internal and external actors. I think that's a consensus that I can say without letting the cat out of the bag in terms of that engagement. But the most important thing is we continue to see us contribute more on the humanitarian side than really the rest of the world combined, even at a time that's very tight in many of those budgets. That goes back, again, well into the Danforth era and before, as you probably know. So one thing that I will, without getting prescriptive to Congress, I will say that it is a very clear and consistent message that the U.S. Congress cares, stands with Sudanese people, and that is not going to change anytime soon. On the Brussels offer, I'll let you know about getting together. It'd be good to do something with the ambassadors here. I used to go through Brussels constantly in the Great Lakes days and have done less so here, but certainly Annette and others have been super engaged and great partners. The spillover effect is disastrous. It is, if there's any silver lining, it's part of why I think we have seen growing diplomatic intensity around trying to solve the conflict. You have millions and millions of refugees that have spilled over into neighboring countries. And just to take one of the more prominent examples, I think we're at 1.3 or 1.4 million Sudanese refugees in Egypt, but that's new refugees on top of the 5 million refugees, or they would call them guests, already in Egypt. This is a tremendous act of hospitality by the neighboring countries across the board, all of them taking them in, some 2 countries over. It is also a genuine economic strain, and in many cases, one of the great things about Sudan is its diversity, but that diversity also means you have many ethnic populations that overlap with neighboring countries. It has been an act primarily of constraint by most of the neighboring countries that they have not actually done the domino effect that could very quickly make this a regional war, much like the DRC was in, say, the 90s. And while some of the neighboring countries have been more constructive than others in terms of how much to not engage, or at least not engage kinetically, we've at least seen constraint be the more dominant form than escalation on a conflict, again, that could very quickly become regional and go out from there. That being said, every month we go without a ceasefire, every month we go without a peace deal, makes those sorts of negative domino effects even more likely. We also, of course, have, in addition to the hunger crisis in Sudan, we have cholera spreading quickly. If you have cholera or other diseases start to spread more, I mean, if you look at, and you have very different refugee experiences, right? Like in Chad, you have camps that are just completely overflowing with people who are coming over severely malnourished. You have populations that are 5x or 10x what the local population would be, which has all the inflationary effects. That's very different than, say, Nairobi or Kampala, where most people are urban refugees. Obviously, you have some camps there. And then, we talked a bit about Egypt. When you get into not just the second year of a conflict, but the second half of a second year of the conflict, then you're talking about not just the polarization internally and online, you're talking about issues for the refugee population about, jobs, settling in, schools, childhood development. And while those may not be as urgent as people facing starvation in Zamzam or Kadugli, it is a very real thing when you're talking about millions and millions of people. So the spillover effect already exists, and it is already getting more pronounced. We're seeing more countries start to constrain their level of hospitality for Sudanese that are there. So all of this is yet another reason that to understand the sooner we get this done, the better. And we do work a lot with the neighboring countries and other African counterparts on how to try to de-escalate some of the things, particularly on the ethnic and tribal side, that could take this conflict into a different space. But it does feel often like you're, squeezing here and there, and it could go over at this point. I think this is a place we think the African Union has a role to play in continuing, even if it can't solve the conflict, to at least play a significant role in deterring the conflict from spreading or becoming more complex. Now, this goes a bit to the first question, which is that well beyond the neighboring countries, we see a growing number of actors and increasingly nefarious actors that are playing. So in addition to the questions of the role of UAE, Egypt, Saudi, which we'll come back to, and why that alignment is one we've engaged with quite a bit, all those actors arguably have some interest in stability in the region. When you're talking about countries further out concentrically or non-state actors that are engaged, whether that's foreign fighters from across the Sahel or some of the other parties that are at play, then you have people for whom even the stability argument is not one that we can come back to. So each passing month, we see more and more actors going there. Now, one of the things that that everyone rightly fears in this case is partition. Partition of the country, by all analysis, would not stabilize the situation. In fact, there's almost no scenario where it's only a two-part division, because the fact is you still have a SAF that's still riverine dominated and an RSF that's still Rizagat dominated, and that's not most of the country. So what's going to happen? You're going to see a much more significant shattering in addition to areas that would be failed states. So it's not a solution that should be seriously considered by any serious actors. Now, on the question of the roles that some of these countries have played, again, it has been our very clear message that this is not a time for any countries, whether they're allies of ours or not, to be funding or fueling or arming actors within. It's a time to be pushing those parties to the peace table. What I do think we have, which we saw somewhat in the Alps talks, is even countries that see this conflict through a different lens and perspective should be able to agree on two areas of things. One is, even as the war continues, humanitarian law has to be respected, civilian protection has to be respected. We need to restore those basic norms. Second, we've got to end the war. Everybody is losing from this war careening off the edge. Everyone should seem to benefit. And even if that doesn't mean that you get your maximalist interest, we should be able to get to mutual interest. Now, for us, if there's one positive part of this understory, it's that the only path forward that everyone can agree on is a unity civilian government, which is what the Sudanese people have wanted for a long time anyway. It is not a war that is meant to end with some sort of power sharing between the two armed groups. Nobody in Sudan thinks that's the right solution. That's, in fact, what led to the war in the first place. So the question is, how do we get back to the process the Sudanese people put in place in 2019? There's no shortage of talent. There's no shortage of people who can help drive this country into inclusive democracy and inclusive prosperity. The exact path of that is obviously part of what all these negotiations will be about. So I think, to the extent that we've seen and continue to see really strong leadership from both Secretary Blinken and President Biden, it's the idea of saying, guys, there has to be a path forward that folks can agree to here, led by the Sudanese people, and backing off of anything that seems to be on fueling the conflict. So I think we will continue to look at how the U.S. can raise the costs of doing the wrong thing, increase the attention on doing the right thing. And I do think, as pitiful as the overall global attention has been, we've seen it growing steadily over the last few months. We've seen Sudanese voices breaking through more often. I think that the results coming out of Switzerland, again, while modest in terms of direct impact, the real issue was a turning point from hopelessness to progress. And once we're starting to question, okay, how much more progress can we get? That's a different kind of diplomatic energy that comes together. And we are going to continue to work 24/7 to explore every chance we can to build on that progress.
Mr. Perriello, thank you for outlining what the US government's doing in this space. And I think, personally, to acknowledge the work that you're doing and the advocacy in this space. I think it's been an important opportunity to highlight that as part of the discussion today. So I wanted to thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continuing to engage in these discussions as we look at ways to support efforts to resolve the conflict in Sudan at the moment.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much.
Oh, I think we need to stay.
Oh.
So just bear with us for 2 minutes.
today to be here to help moderate this panel on one of the last topics that Tom and Lisa touched on, which is the protection of civilians in Sudan. It's no secret to anyone in this room the scale and ferocity of the atrocities that have been committed in the war to date, and the way that interlinks with what has become the largest humanitarian crisis in the world at this stage. I'm super pleased to be joined today by a very distinguished panel to discuss this. Nimat Ahmadi is the founder and president of Darfur Women's Action Group, and she has been active in working on these issues in Darfur and helping to lead the charge on the ground for women's rights and against gender-based violence for over 20 years. Dan Sullivan is the director for the Middle East, Africa, and Asia at Refugees International, a fellow colleague of mine. I'm really deeply grateful he's here. In addition to being at RI for a number of years, he previously worked for Save Darfur for 5 or 6 years, so he's very deep on these issues and has just returned from a trip to the Nuba Mountains, and so we're very excited to hear about that. And then Kuskundi Abdulshafi is the senior regional director or advisor for Africa at Freedom House, and he has over a decade of experience in the Horn of Africa working on governance, democracy, and human rights. And Julie Gregory is a regional analyst at the Stimson Center and a true expert on the intersection of peacekeeping, protection of civilians, and human security. And we're really grateful to have you here today. I know she has an upcoming report that's going to touch on a number of these issues. So in the interest of time, I'm going to issue sort of further opening remarks and dive right into the conversation. And Kuskundi, if you don't mind, if we could start with you a little bit. You've been watching the situation in Sudan, but particularly in Darfur, very, very closely, and you hear regularly from family and friends on the ground there. The fighting in and around Al-Fashir has grown quite ferocious in recent weeks, but there have been new waves of fighting in other parts of Sudan as well. Could you just bring us up to speed quickly about what's happening in terms of the nature of the conflict and the intersection with atrocities in Darfur, but then spread out a little bit in other parts of the country, and what you're seeing as the biggest opportunities to make some progress on the protection of civilians?
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming today, and thanks Stimson Center for hosting us. It's really great time to talk about Sudan, but particularly to talk about civilian protection. And just to get back to your question on what happens in Al-Fashir recently, but also how that tells the trajectory of the conflict in the coming months that are coming. Basically, that is more conflict that is personal. Mm-hmm. The first wave of attack was RSF want to take regional Darfur from south, and it was mostly between the former arms and their paramilitary. But the dynamics of that conflict absolutely changed when the recent attack happened on Al-Fashir. But though the trends are the same with regard to absolute and direct targeting of the civilians, bombing that are happening, particularly happens every RSF attack, but also, intentional destruction of public property, that's like schools, university, hospitals, everywhere that there's any survival means. I think this is being kind of a similar trend in the different parts of Sudan as well, either that is Al Jazeera or Central Sudan, but it is more furious when it comes to Darfur, because there is this historical factors that really increase the likelihood of mass atrocities to occur. And I think what this is telling us for the coming months, and that's to just connect to question of the civilian protection, is that the fashir happens when there is, in the edge of the rainy season. Similarly, very similar, though that is the North Darfur, because it is a bit more Sahara-like and it is more easier to move. There's less seasonal river. It was happened that attack in the different types. Yes, the RSF was not successful in taking over the city, but also it also hindered the need to create new narrative, because the RSF main source of mobilization and recruitment is also loot. The less likely that there will be higher loot to take, it is less likely to mobilize largest military to come to attack. And that impacted its ability to mobilize more military. However, as the dry season coming now is starting from December, that is always the season of war. And what happened is that what we are seeing is that this is more time that RSF will be able to get more, easy to get arms from Central Africa, because it was absolutely impossible at this time. That is why they tried to repair the Niala airport. Through Darfur, the two bridges of Kubri, of Kaja and Bare were made very difficult to. So it is easy to use the open border to bring the more guns, but also more recruitment. However, on the other side of the armed groups, the joint armed groups, they spend all of these 9 months in the eastern Sudan training a large amount of military forces. And all of these are coming. It is a time where the land cruiser can hit the ground running and moving. And what this tells us is that the trajectory and the trends of the conflict is going to be very tough in the end of December, probably up to January and March. And that is really necessary what kind of a picture we will be looking for. We have at least currently in Darfur few outstanding forces. For instance, Abdul Wahid have a large amount of forces in Mara Mountain, but those forces are also indirectly involved in some of the conflict, like in Fashir and other places, which is very difficult, meaning that if this confrontation happens and continues to increase, you have a Masalis forces that are trained in the east that are coming to take over Al-Junaina. So we will be looking at Al-Fashir, we will be looking at Niala, we will be looking at Zalingi and Al-Junaina in an absolutely different angle. And there is very high likelihood that atrocities will occur. And this necessitates that it is not too late to have a conversation about a mechanism for civilian protection and atrocity prevention. Even within the US, there is so much policy framework for civilian protection. In the UN, beyond the peacekeeping forces, there is global responsibility to protect. At the African Union, there is different mechanism. There is East African Standby Force, there is different. I think it is not too late to have a conversation about civilian protection in Sudan if we have to do something in the end of December, but early January when this, when the summer campaign starts. So I think it is really, really urgent to looking at the trends of the conflict, the ability of even the renewed army embargo to really hold any water with regard to this open border. It is a region, Sudan is a country that bordering, just I will say the name and you imagine, Libya, Chad, Central Africa, South Sudan, Ethiopia. It is just, all of these countries has a conflict. It's very difficult to say, okay, there is anything that, when it's a very huge border and there is so much malicious global illicit business that are very active there, either state or non-state actors, trans-regional organized crimes, either in the mineral sector or either in the drugs or any other organized crimes, including violent extremists. So it is very hard to imagine that without having serious forces to protect civilians, this can help. And I think this is not have to be something big. We have to start with something. I remember in 2003 in Sudan, when we were calling for international force to come to protect civilians in Darfur in 2004, that was a crime against the state. You can't even say that. But after a few months or less than a year, the government accepted, the Sudan government accepted for the AU forces to come with conditions. And then after that, they changed the helmet and become UN, and then becomes the largest UN mission ever, with 21,000 military forces that ever happens, and that was in Darfur. I think currently, with regard to Sudan, whatever the caretaker government in Port Sudan saying, or with regard to whatever other actors saying, I think this is a time to put on table on some sort of mechanism which it have at least create safer zone for civilian. If you can't save the whole region, you can create safer zone for civilian protection in this huge cities where there is a large, hundreds of thousands of civilians living. And that can be a starting point, and this port can play some role on army embargo monitoring, but also access to food road and other services. So I think that is what I will end it, that it is very important and it is very timely to have a conversation about civilian protection in Sudan.
Great, thank you. Julie, Koskondi has just put a lot on the table, particularly around, as bad as the fighting is right now, what we can anticipate to see as the next fighting season comes into bloom. And the timing here is interesting because the Secretary General's report to the Security Council on civilian protection options in Sudan is due shortly, and the Council is due to meet, I believe, at the end of October on this issue. Could you presage for us a bit what we think might be in the report, because I know a bunch of our organizations have been involved in trying to feed into it, and then what are the lessons that we can learn from previous peacekeeping endeavors, like much along the lines of what Kuskundi just touched upon, both the large and the small interventions on civilian protection, and what lessons can we draw from that for what we might be facing over the next year or two?
Thanks, Hardin. I might go in reverse order,
Sure.
starting from the past and going up to the present. So Sudan has had a significant history of peace operations. Over the last 20 years, there have been 8 peace operations deployed to Sudan, and that includes the current UN peacekeeping mission in the disputed Abyei area that continues to protect civilians there. But as was pointed out, the most notable peace operation was the UN African Union hybrid operation in Darfur that was deployed from 2007 to 2020. And it was successful in physically protecting tens of thousands of civilians despite significant challenges. And it served as an effective deterrent to violence. Now, we're talking about a region, Darfur, the size of Spain. It's significant. And so when you're considering that there were 23,000 troops and police on the ground, that's actually not sufficient to cover the entire region. And so the mission significantly struggled to provide more proactive protection, especially in the earlier years that it was deployed. So there's something to be learned there from a more static approach to protection, which UNAMID took in the earlier days of its deployment. And internally displaced persons reacted well to that. They sought refuge near the UN peacekeeping mission bases and team sites, knowing that having physical proximity would give them better protection. And so I think that's something important to point out. While military boots on the ground, as we're considering the current situation, would not be sufficient to cover the entire region, let alone the entire country, to protect civilians, static protection is something that we should strongly consider going forward. And then more recently, the UN Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan, known as UNITAMS, was mandated to assist government-led protection efforts and had a countrywide mandate, unlike UNAMID, although it was supposed to be focused on Darfur, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile states. And Stimson has put out a publication this past week on emerging lessons from UNITAMS. So I will only speak briefly to these emerging lessons, but encourage all of you to take the publication that's outside, and for those online to go to the Stimson Center website. So UNITAMS was one of the larger UN political missions that has been deployed, but it's still very, very small, especially in comparison to UNAMID, and it was deployed from late 2020 to February 2024 when it was closed down, following a request from the Sudanese authorities. It only had 250 civilian staff in total, and it was supposed to support civilian protection efforts across the country. That's an enormous task. But I'll just highlight 3 key takeaways from UNITAM's experience that I think really applies to today before transitioning into current options. One is we need to have genuine clarity on what we mean when we're talking about protection. Are we talking about physical protection? Are we talking about promotion and protection of human rights? Are we talking about the protection of civilians as understood in UN peacekeeping missions? I think lack of clarity around what we mean and what we're aiming for can really hinder a united approach and create unnecessary confusion. Also, there's a clear need for a protection of civilian strategy. It's not enough to just talk about protecting civilians. We need to have a clear vision and of what an end state should look like, and then a plan of how to execute that, including possible mechanisms and how those mechanisms could contribute to protection outcomes. And then additionally, protection needs to be mainstreamed. We need to be sure that advancing the protection of civilians in Sudan is prioritized and mainstreamed in everything not only from the political talks that remain ongoing, but also the possible kinetic protection mechanisms that are under discussion. So quickly, going to the first part of your question, Hardin, about current options on the table, I think it's really important that we don't think about one or two options. We need to think about the full period, the short, medium, and long term, because those will need different responses to the protection of civilians. So as has been mentioned, green zones or safe zones are a viable, immediate, or shorter term protection option. Just so we're all on the same page, green zone is a military term that refers to a safe haven within a zone of combat, in contrast to red zones, which is the zone of combat itself. And so green zones could provide internally displaced persons safe refuge within a very specific, highly limited area. This could be around airports, transit hubs, or where internally displaced persons are already congregated. In the medium term, when we do have some sort of full or partial cessation of hostilities or ceasefire agreement, we will need a monitoring and verification mechanism. As we've seen with the Jeddah Declaration, it's not enough to have the parties come to agreement. We need to make sure that they're held accountable and that there is an independent and partial mechanism that makes sure that they're implementing these commitments. And here I would turn to the experience of the International Joint Military Commission in the Nuba Mountains that was deployed in the early 2000s, as well as UNITAMS's Permanent Ceasefire Committee. Both of these were highly successful, I think, because they were localized, they had joint and equitable representation of the parties, and they had a convening power that was perceived by the parties as independent and impartial. Now, these were highly localized, small efforts. So just to go back to the point that's been raised, you can have a small effort that has a big impact. And in the longer term, I think we definitely, or I should say medium to longer term, we need to be talking about peace operations and deploying either a UN peace operation, an African Union peace support operation, or a hybrid mission that is there to protect civilians and that is ideally connected to a political process.
Julia, thank you very much. I was in UN headquarters during in peacekeeping operations in the stand-up of UNIMED. And I remember in the run-up to that, right, it was one of those things that was seen as a political impossibility at the council with China and the role they were playing. And so much of the conversation now around these sets of issues is how it's basically impossible to get anything through the council. And I think the pushback to that is that you have to try and you have to begin to set the table and build the pathway politically, knowing that it's going to take some time. So thank you for that. Niamat, can I turn to you to talk a little bit about the situation of gender-based violence in the conflict, but particularly in Darfur? I mean, you've been working on these issues for decades now. We're hearing just, impossibly grim stories about what's happening in terms of the use of gender-based violence as a weapon of war. What are you seeing and hearing from the ground, and what does the Darfur Women's Action Network see as potential options for support on the international community side to try to lessen some of the severity of these crimes against women?
Well, thank you. I would like to thank Stimson and Refugee International for putting this event together. I think it is really timely to have this kind of conversation. Speaking to you today after a year and a half from the most vicious war with this destruction and demonization of the people of Sudan, and Darfur being a region that impacted by the war's atrocities for more than 20 years. You can imagine what women have to tolerate, but also what everybody else have to tolerate and to face in the face of this campaign of destruction. Both sides have committed the most heinous crimes and all type of gross human rights violation, but mostly the crisis in Sudan, gender-based in this crisis in Sudan or this war, gender-based violence has been the most defining feature of the crisis. The first gender-based violence incident or rape incident, to say it right. It was reported at 12 p.m. in Khartoum, the first day of the attack. And unfortunately, in Sudan, there is the international community does not learn. It seems people are not learning because rape in Darfur has been used systematic in a very vicious way against women and girls. Particularly, it's ethnically targeted and motivated attack on women from the indigenous African tribes that we have seen from 20 years ago. Again, it was repeated recently in Al Junaina against the Masalit and many other indigenous African tribes in Darfur. While the crisis in Khartoum is horrifying enough, similarly, the cases that we have seen and witnessed in Darfur against women, it has been perpetrated. Women have been abducted and taken away. Until today, many women, their families do not know their whereabouts. They have not returned. We don't know what is their situation. There are cases of rape reported even this morning, yesterday, in the area of Al-Fashir. Whenever the attack escalated in Al-Fashir, there is increase of report of gender-based violence. The youngest victims were 7 years old, you can imagine. And this is obvious because of lack of accountability, but also lack of protection. And I don't see the protection of women can be done in a vacuum from civilian protection in Sudan or in Darfur in particular, because both sides have been committing gross violation against the civilians, but also the rapid support forces are precisely targeting a specific group of people. Like their insistence of attack in Al-Fashir consistently, mostly attacking the most vulnerable internally displaced people. In their shelling, the casualties are women and children. At the same time, attacking women precisely and purposefully to destroy the fabric of the community, to weaken. They do know the culture very well because women represent the center of our society. And in order to break the dignity of the family and to break the dignity of the communities you are attacking, you have to attack their women, make them feel that they are unable to protect the women. So I saw the number and the context and the magnitude of attack on women in Sudan should have shook the world conscious and prompted them to act long time ago. Immediately after the start of war in Sudan, we started calling for civilian protection because we do know that without civilian protection, there will not be any way to end this war. Both sides are very adamant about continuing their crisis, but also the wide spread of rapid support forces. They are using this deadly tactic of occupying civilian homes, fighting inside the city, sometimes holding these families hostage. And forced marriages has been reported, forcing people to marry them, multiple men marrying one woman. And these are like cases that are reported in Khartoum. In Darfur, many families were cut off. They don't even know the extent of how their family members have suffered because of the systematic cutting of the communication means from the beginning. What happened in Al Junaina, in Zalinji, in many other places in Darfur. And then the level of militarization right now. Recent report until yesterday, we have learned that the rapid support forces right now is extending, coming into the cities and forcing people to recruit. In my hometown, report confirmed that they come to the traditional leaders and they say it is now time for youth and men to recruit to defend. So I am sitting here talking to you, expecting my family to face the wars in the coming, because the leaders in the city refuse, and they have to refuse because they have nothing to fight for. They already are living in a Stone Age slavery. Since the rapid support forces have taken over the city, nobody felt safe or able to flee or even do anything within the city. There is report of disappearance of young people who leave their home right now. Most of the young people from 16 to 25 are confined to staying home. Women, young girls can't leave their homes to go anywhere, to do anything. And all women of all ages are so terrified. So that is simply the current state of the situation, but also the danger and the regional aspect of this crisis and this war. The Rapid Support Forces have recruited fighters from various African countries, Niger, Mali, Central African Republic, Libya, Chad. And some women were taken across the border. But also the fear, if there is no civilian protection, the fear of a spillover. Right now, tension already run high in Chad between government officials, also between citizens. There are those who are lenient toward, like, sympathetic with the RSF, and there are those who are against this. And that the next place to see this crisis move into is Chad, Central African Republic, Libya. These are all fragile states. Both sides, when they kill, the danger of this, and I wanted this really to emphasize on this, they say Allahu Akbar and kill. They include slaughter people in front of their families. So there is also potential for extremists to be recruited and join and come into this. And there are countries with history of this. Sudan has its own history, but also Mali, Niger, and this with African countries. So the international community always really behind. When we were talking about Al-Fashir is a ticking bomb, we surpassed that moment because the atrocities that we are fearing is already happening right now. People are dying in masses. Hospitals are all completely destroyed. Today, as I was coming here, one of our team members who insisted to staying there to help people because she's among the only people, a few people who have bank account, and you know, many of you who are humanitarians know how that works, to be able to transfer funds so that they can feed people in their camp. She lost her daughter. She was counting and very anxious about the deaths of children in Zamzam camp, and today her daughter and she was crushed. This is kind of not only her, but most of the people who remain there insisted that they will be there to help the people survive are leaving or even getting killed. So it is a high time for civilian protection. What we called for is that, of course, Darfur is huge. Sudan is way big than you can imagine, but we know where the problem is. The Rapid Support Forces getting weapon supplies through the border, getting recruits coming from different countries through the border. If we can get, it's like somewhere they can start with the places where large number of internally displaced people, like Al Junaina, Zalinji, Niala, where Kalma camp, Al Fashir, two of the largest camps. This is like 2 million people residing in this city, and it is suburban. At least these places. And then blocking the borders of these countries where, like, blocking the border of Al Junaina. The special envoy spoke about the humanitarian aid and that there is progress. Unfortunately, that is not, the humanitarian aid was not progress because it came through Adare, and it feels like they did something. Adare is coming into Al Junaina. Al Junaina is a stronghold of the Rapid Support Forces where massacre and slaughter being committed last year. They are opening this on purpose to feed their fighters and also taking advantage of bringing the humanitarian aid. Every convoy, they said, will receive credible information from refugee camp in Chad that every convoy is followed by trucks carrying weapons into this area. Provided that what Koskondi mentioned, 2 bridges, main bridges out of Al Junaina are broken. So they know that that humanitarian aid is not going out. So protection is really needed right now. And I hope that the Security Council make the right decision, because if we waited until December, there is no, many people will be left there to be protected, and then desperately needed humanitarian aid. Also, it's an aspect of protecting people from dying in silence. Bringing humanitarian aid will help people survive, will help those Who are there to help others survive, like our team member whose daughter died simply because there is no medicine in the camp. There's no enough food or nutrition for children. And then accountability also will serve as a protection and deterrent factor. If Bashir was held accountable or surrendered to be tried in The Hague, Al-Burhan and Hemeti will be hesitant to start this war. Unfortunately, that is a huge failure. And then financial accountability, because things in Sudan has been treated as traditional conflict resolution. This is not a conflict. It's not a civil war. It's not intercommunal the way they call it. It is a systemic atrocities by those who are powerful, have money, guns, and the ability to kill more people and rape more women. And when the negotiation happened, the international community only talked to a few small handful leaders who have guns, have power, and who started the war in the first place. People like women, civil society group, youth leaders who are right on the ground as of today, acting as frontline humanitarian workers, are not invited. We end up with failure. So we have to change those dynamic in order to how many lessons we have to learn from Sudan. So I will stop here, but I think it is really needed right now, and we have to start somewhere. But I also want to emphasize that it is not peace keeping, because that was a mistake with UNAMID. The mandate was crafted with Chapter 7, but it was made to be a peacekeeping. There was no peace on the ground to keep. Today, there is no visibility for peace anytime soon, so there is a need for peacemaking forces on the ground. Then that will create an enabling environment for more investigation to take place, and then for accountability, delivery of humanitarian aid, then we can have peace on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Nima. So Dan, we have about 10 minutes left, so just with the interest of time, we'd really like to hear, you have spent a lot of time visiting countries around Sudan, and then the Nuba Mountains quite recently, and throughout this have been doing a ton of work with the emergency response rooms, and then less in the Nuba Mountains, where you saw some of the corollary organizations, the local organizations, that really have been the only instrument for delivering humanitarian aid over the last year and a half, and their role will continue to be incredibly important, if massively under-resourced at this stage moving forward. But they're also in the front lines of this protection crisis. What have you been hearing from them about options for civilian protection and the kind of steps the international community needs to take?
Yeah, thank you. I think I want to just start by re-highlighting something that Special Envoy said earlier, pointing out that the emergency response rooms were in the conversation for winning the Nobel Prize. And I think that's pretty significant, because they have been, amidst all of this, everything you've heard today and what you've followed with the atrocities happening, the famine, the emergency response rooms and other local mutual aid groups have been a bright spot in this and are pushing things not only in Sudan, but globally when we talk about new ways of doing aid. I think there's a lot of lessons that we've already seen and that are coming out. In terms of the protection of civilians, the emergency response rooms and other local groups have been doing protection of civilians from the very beginning. I mean, they came together very organically in their neighborhoods to take care of each other, did a lot of work to evacuate the most vulnerable, have set up communal kitchens, women-friendly spaces, just trying to share information on what is safe, what's not safe. So they're already there. They're already doing protection of civilians. And I think there's opportunities there to support them more. And as I've spoken to different local representatives, whether in Sudan or a lot of them are based in Kampala or Nairobi or some here in the US, one of the consistent things I've heard them say is one of the best ways that they can get protection is by being recognized as legitimate humanitarian actors, who should be protected under international humanitarian law. And they're clear-eyed about it, that this is not, you get labeled as a humanitarian, you're going to be safe. They're outside of the immediate protection, but there is power in that recognition, and there is power in having the international community speak out when the types of things that happen to international humanitarian workers when they get detained or harassed or extorted, that when that happens to local groups that do that, that there's just as much of that outrage. So that's something I've heard consistently is something that's very important. I also recognize that the local groups, ERRs, are not monolithic. We've also seen where some groups have started to get more aid and they've become targets. So we have to be very conscious of what the locals say and what they both in terms of aid and protection, they're the ones who know their communities best. And so I think just finding ways to support them. And a couple of ways of doing that, and these are ideas I've heard from people working closely with the ERRs on the ground and from the ERRs themselves and other local groups is, number one, making sure that there is the communications, telecoms ability across the country so that people can coordinate and they can warn each other about when there are risks. Another is to create maybe a fund, a protection fund, so when people are at immediate risk and need to be evacuated, that's available. That's something that can support. And then just doing some of the things that the UN does in other areas. OCHA keeps close tabs of instances where humanitarian aid is blocked or where humanitarians are attacked or are harassed. And so keeping that data and making it a big issue for the warring parties to know that these people are recognized and there is protection. And again, there's limits, and ultimately I think some of the broader things we've talked about will be needed. But on the most immediate local level, there's a lot more room. We've already seen these local groups networking more. We've seen them learning to interact with the international infrastructure, international donors learning more how to work with them. So I think there has been notable progress. Of course, in the context of how large this crisis is, there's a lot more that needs to be done. And we just end with saying that both in terms of aid and in terms of protection, I think what the message from these local groups is, trust us, we know our communities and we know what to do. Trust us and support us.
Great, Dan. Thank you very much. I do wonder whether or not there's been a dialogue between some of these groups and the Secretary General's team preparing this report. And I hope that has been taking place. If it hasn't, it's something we probably need to lift up. So we only have about 5 or 6 minutes left. We'll probably take a little bit extra time if the audience has the patience for it. Can we go to audience questions? And just put your hand up. We'll bring a mic to you. Identify yourself, and then just a short, quick question to go with it. One question here in the front. We'll take 3 questions and then go to answers.
Thank you. My name is Dennis Owing. My short question is about peacekeeping mission. We have noted in the past that the peacekeeping mission in Mali failed. The one in DRC too failed. And there is already a question as to whether the UN peacekeeping mission as a whole is a good thing for specific conflicts, example, the Sudan conflict, and as to whether the African Union or the East African standby force would be better placed in terms of legitimacy, but also proximity. So I guess my question is, would you have the UN peacekeeping mission, or rather the AU or the East African forces to carry out peacekeeping mission in Sudan?
Great. Thank you, Dennis. Question over here.
Hi, thank you. Brian Johnson with Department of State. This is mostly directed at Ms. Amati, but obviously the panel, if you're interested in answering. Ms. Amati referenced rapid support forces recruitment through adjacent countries like the Central African Republic, Chad, Libya. And obviously it's a very multi-varied phenomenon and a very multi-dimensional conflict and regional conflict. I'm just curious if you could kind of speak more to what is exactly incentivizing people to be coming across the border and join in this conflict. Is it a purely material and economic motive? Are there ethnic and ideological discernments that are kind of driving that? Just curious if you could speak to that for a bit.
Great. And let's take one more.
Hi, my name is Miyada. My question is tailored more to Daniel. You mentioned that you were recently in the Nuba Mountains. Can you just speak about a little bit more about what you were doing there, your trip, We're hearing that, there's a famine specifically in the Nuba Mountains. And I'm also hearing that RSF presence is not really much so in that area, but more so North Kordofan. Can you speak about what you've seen in terms of the border issue there and why there isn't any aid being brought into the Nuba Mountains and how that's, correlating to the famine in that specific area?
Great, fantastic. So we've got a question on who's best placed to do peacekeeping, if that's the route we end up on, a question on the regional dimensions or the regional drivers of people coming across the border for conflict, and then an update on the Nuba Mountains, going a little bit deeper on that. So who wants to take the question on peacekeeping? Do you want to?
If you would like to start, I'm happy to follow up.
But this is particularly interesting right now because we also have a resolution that passed this past year that creates a mechanism for getting assessed contributions from the United Nations to the African Union in a way of actually, so it can be an African Union-led effort, but using funding that comes from the UN. So there are some exciting options here. Go ahead, Kuskundi.
Yeah, I think generally what we're talking about Sudan currently, if we are talking about the civilian protection in Darfur, we are talking about a protection in a condition where there is no de facto state exists. So it is hard for us to talk about, it has never happened comparatively. In the civil wars in Africa, it always happens in the bush and the civilians come to the city. This is opposite. It happens in the city, destroy all the city and institutions, and people went to the IDP camps, and then there is no state. And that is where there is high likelihood of any small group with a very few arms, like children, the kids of 12 years old can kill 150 people in 2 hours because there's nothing to detect it. So what we are talking about, this situation is more about a preventive forces that can create safer zone where those atrocities can be reduced, the likelihood of those to happen. And who brings this is AU, African Union, or an individual country say, oh, okay, I want to contribute my force to bring this under the R2P. It works for us, at least in Sudan scenario, we reduce that atrocity. So I think we are mostly the conversation is more about, it's more about what is the scope and what is the mandate for this force and how can it help? And I think there is different, localized mechanism and what we say about this civilian force. And, Sudan, the war is not only between the RSF and TAF. You have several other armed actors that has ability to do the similar or even more damaging if they engage in the conflict. But they are now, some of them, they are standing by and watching. So it is hard to predict where dynamics go, but at least having some sort of recognized mechanism that can protect civilians, but also monitor, helps to monitor the dynamic. You have technology, helicopters, drones looking about the armed movement, attack is going to happen. It can work with the local civil society, tribal leaders, whatever power exists to actually intervene and prevent those. So I think this can be more like not a mission-ish, like UN peacekeeping through UN Security Council or something huge. Within that mandate, but at least some sort of mechanism. We're trying to think about something more suitable. And yes, definitely I agree, more of these peacekeeping forces are better because there was no peace.
If I can just jump in and add to that, I think part of the reason that discussion around a UN peacekeeping mission is not currently on the table for immediate protection of civilians' efforts is multifold. One, the current environment, the current conflict environment is not appropriate for a UN peacekeeping mission. We have the peacekeeping principles. One of those principles is consent of the parties. There is a clear lack of consent to the deployment of a peacekeeping mission by the current conflict parties. And this is a large obstacle for moving forward and one we need to navigate cleverly and creatively going forward. And that includes putting pressure on the parties to accept an international intervention going forward. There are other options on the table that Hardin mentioned. We do have African Union peace support operations as well as other regionally led interventions which have been referenced. The exciting option that Hardin mentioned earlier is the fact that the Security Council adopted Resolution 2719, which allows for the partial funding of an African Union-led peace support operation on a case-by-case basis. And Sudan could be a potential option in terms of utilizing those assessed contributions to enable a peace support operation to be deployed in the future. Now, we keep coming back to the issue of consent and consent of the parties. We could be talking about a peace enforcement mission, but I think there's generally a lack of political will by African Union member states to deploy that type of operation in the current environment. So that's why when I was talking earlier, I would situate discussion of a peacekeeping mission or another type of peace operation in the medium to long term because of those obstacles. Ideally, we would want a peacekeeping mission to be deployed in connection to a political process. That's going to give a peace operation the best chance of contributing to long-term peace and ensuring that the protection of civilians remains ongoing. I think last point I'll end on, just for the purpose of time, we need to recognize that the deployment of peace operations takes significant time. Outside of discussions of political will, consent of the parties, these mechanisms do take a bit of time. And again, that's another reason why it's not under immediate discussion for deployment. But it should be in terms of our medium to long-term trajectory.
Great, thank you. Nimat, a couple of thoughts on regional motivations?
I'll say a little bit about the peace operation, and then
Please.
we'll dive into that. In terms of what type of peace forces are needed, I think looking at the situation and the danger of the continuation and expansion of this, and also the regional aspect of it, I think international intervention is really important to consider. I think the Security Council has to do its best. I remember, we've been advocating for years. In 2003, 2004, nobody saw that the creation of the International Commission of Inquiry was visible. That was deployment of the African Union, or even deployment of UNAMID later on was visible. The referral to the ICC, nobody saw it. But as an advocate, we tell the truth, and we ask for what is appropriate. And what is appropriate is right now there is a need for civilian protection mechanism, looking at all mechanisms. We even, at some point, we call for, if the Security Council is paralyzed, what we can do, we have to consider different strategies, the coalition of willing. There is a responsibility to protect aspect. If the Security Council cannot do, if there are countries that are willing, we do want to see U.S. leadership course. We had this conversation with several other, some other European actors, the European Union members of parliament. They said if there is any sort of civilian protection, we will contribute funding. So that's kind of, we spoke. Within African Union, there is willingness and there is appetite for this. I remember in June when the massacre happened in Al Junaina, we had a briefing with IGAD, African Union groups, and then they took it really serious, and they were talking about having discussion with the standby, East African standby forces. So we have to push, and we have to just insist in and demanding that, because looking at the situation on the ground, what else you are going to recommend? And by December, we will not be in this situation. Many of us sitting here will have their families being killed in masses. Let alone those who are confined into the internal displaced camp for years. And until when that the international community can have the ability to protect civilians or prevent atrocities or do something to end it at some point, to have a good story to tell, the story of success. And that is what I want to see. And not just me, but I want you all to want to see that. We want more from our international community. They obligated themselves to this instrument. They have to take to meet their obligation to this instrument, and unless we tell them, they will not do it. So we have to consistently tell them. In regard to the regional recruit and the people, it's the ideology, number one, because they have all these RSF fighters having the idea of having an Arab state, Arab Islamic state in Sudan, mostly Darfur. This is the promise that we're being given to them since the Bashir regime, and then now, and combined with economic interest, because they pledged them a huge amount of money. We have seen that even back then, the amount of the payment for RSF is nothing in comparison with the regular Sudanese army, and because of that, some people were recruited to, and then the tribal aspect right now kind of exacerbated that. Today in Darfur, there is only 2 Arab clans that are not involved, Bani Hussein and Maalia, which are very small clans, and they very well aligned with the indigenous African Mozambique group. So every single tribe is involved. So there is no way out of this unless there is neutral body there. So I will stop here, and thank you for listening to us and for your questions.
Thank you. Dan, just a very quick burst on the Nuba.
Yeah, so a lot that could be said, but let me point you to, I have a report that came out on this. It's on the Refugees International website, so I point you to that. Just really quickly would say, you know, one of the reasons to go there was because, as the title of the report says, it's a window into the broader crisis in Sudan. So, you know, very quickly, it's controlled by a separate group that has been roughly neutral. So it's an area that has been safe compared to other parts of the country. And so that means lots of people from all different parts of the country have come there. So I went there and I interviewed people from all different parts of Sudan who arrived, and we're talking about the famine conditions they're facing, the atrocities they faced, and then also the local groups and what they're doing. So again, the report goes more into that, but we just say it's a window into what's going on, and an opportunity to kind of raise some attention. And also, there is opportunity to get more aid in from South Sudan into that. So I think that's a really important point, especially after the rainy season. And let me just end by saying, I think when we have these conversations, people are looking for what can be done. And one thing that Refugees International and several other groups are doing is trying to bring more attention into the role of the UAE in arming the RSF. There have been a lot of other external actors, but no one as egregious as the UAE in arming the RSF. The NBA recently had 2 games, preseason games at the UAE, and the Emirates will be hosting a in-season tournament for the NBA. So that's something we've been putting out a lot of attention, and we'll be trying to push more so that the NBA and its players speak out about that role of the UAE. And you can go to speakoutonsudan.org to learn more about that. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So just panel, thank you so much for your time, your insights, your wisdoms on this. Thank you, Stimson, for hosting us, and to Tom and Lisa for a really great fireside chat to get us kicked off. And audience, thank you so much for your patience and for sticking out throughout the entirety of the conference. Thanks very much.